Hello and welcome in a new episode preparing you for the PMP exam. I'm your instructor Nader Omran. In this episode we will discuss the process of identifying stakeholders. At the end of this episode you will be able to list what we need to create a stakeholder register. You will also be able to identify the major stakeholders in your project and discovering stakeholders which may contribute to stakeholder register creation. Also, you will be able to analyze stakeholders' influences in your project. At the end, you will be able to create stakeholder register for your project. Identify stakeholders. It's the second process in the initiating process group. Also, the first process in the stakeholder management knowledge area. By the way, this knowledge area were added by the 5th edition of the PMBOK guide. The definition of this process in the glossary of the PMBOK guide as follows. Identify stakeholders is the process of identifying the people, groups, or organizations that could impact or be impacted by a decision, activity, or outcome of the project. Analyzing and documenting relevant information regarding their interests, involvement, interdependencies, influence, and potential impact on project success. Now, let's look inside this process. Can we remember this figure? Those are the well-known stakeholders in most projects, internal and external to the organization. Those persons or groups may have a negative or a positive impact on your project. You have to collect information about all stakeholders that are relevant to your project, and that could be even the public. You should also determine the power of the organization's internal stakeholders. For instance, is the person a functional manager, a senior manager, or a line worker? Each of them has a different power and interest and impact on the project. It's really important to identify the stakeholders at the early beginning of the project and classify them according to their interest, influence, and involvement in the project. Why? To fulfill their expectation from the project. Also, knowing the timing of stakeholders' involvement in the project will enhance the positive influences and reduce the negative impacts. In this process, you will need to create a strategy to analyze their level of interest, expectations, power, and influences. And this assessment of the stakeholders should be reviewed and evaluated periodically to adjust changes that may happen through the project life. Let's see what we need to perform this process. There are 4 inputs to this process: project charter, procurement documents, enterprise environmental factors, and organizational process assets. Project charter.
Tell me why we need the project charter as an input to identify stakeholders.
Well, as we said, the project charter is the trigger of the project. In other mean, the green light to start a project. The project charter includes information about the internal and external stakeholders that has impact or impacted by the project, such as sponsor, customers, departments in the organization, or other participating groups. The second input is procurement documents. You should collect these documents if the project triggered by an existing contract. For instance, the organization may have a long-term contract with a supplier that provides different services. In this case, both parties in the contract will be a key stakeholder in your stakeholders register, and also other relevant parties, such as supplier. The third input is enterprise environmental factors.
We learned that it may enhance or constrains a project. How can the enterprise environmental factors influence me by identifying stakeholders?
For example, you will need to know about organizational or company culture and structure to identify the culture and the power level of the identified stakeholders. Governmental or industry standards. For example, governmental regulations which you should take in consideration, as well as product standards also. For instance, you are not allowed to initiate a project for building a marijuana farm. This is a governmental regulation. And a pharmacy standard project must follow the product standard of health associations, etc. Global, regional, or local trends and practices or habits. Fourth input to this process is the organizational process assets. The organizational process assets that can influence the identified stakeholders process include, but are not limited to, Stakeholders Register templates. Most organizations have own standard templates, processes, or documents, which include the Stakeholder Register templates.
But what if the organization doesn't have the standard templates?
Then you must create such templates for your project, which may become the standard templates in the future in your organization. Also, you may need the lessons learned from previous projects or phases. This is the document where lessons and experiences learned from previous projects are noted. We may need also the Stakeholder Register from previous projects to identify how you will perform your Stakeholder Register for this project. And here how we perform this process using the tools and techniques. The first tool and technique is the Stakeholder Analysis. This is a technique of systematically gathering and analyzing quantitative and qualitative information to determine whose interests should be taken into account throughout the project. The Stakeholder Analysis technique is all about collecting and analyzing the information you gathered about the stakeholders and evaluating this data quantitatively and qualitatively to determine their interests, expectations, and influence in your project. And trying to relate their interests, expectation, and influence to the purpose of the project. This technique also helps to identify the relationship among stakeholders, also to the project, to enhance the project's chance of success.
How can I apply this analysis?
Well, stakeholders analysis generally follows 3 steps. Step 1. Identifying all considered stakeholders and relevant information.
What kind of information?
Information such as their roles, departments, interests, knowledge levels, expectations, and influence levels. Key stakeholders are much easy to identify. They include anyone in a decision-making or management role who has a direct relation to the project deliverables or outcome, such as, but not limited to, the sponsor, the project manager, and the customer. Customer is the requesting organization. Sponsor is the performing organization. You will discover other stakeholders by interviewing the key stakeholders. The Stakeholders Register will expand until you got all potential stakeholders. Step 2. Classify the potential impact or support that each stakeholder could generate. This is how to evaluate their support or impact to your project. And this can be done by classifying and prioritizing all stakeholders to ensure efficient management strategy to satisfy their expectations.
What you mean by classifying and prioritizing?
There are many classification models available, and you can even create your own. The most known models are Power Interest Grid, Power Influence Grid, Influence Impact Grid, Power Urgency and Legitimacy Grid. Here a graph is plotted as shown, where horizontal line shows the interest and vertical line represents the power. Power Interest Grid. Here you are grouping the stakeholders based on their level of authority, presented as power, and their level of concern, presented as interest, regarding the project outcomes. Power Influence Grid. This is grouping the stakeholders based on their level of authority, presented as power, and their active involvement, presented as influence in the project. Influence Impact Grid. Grouping the stakeholders based on their active involvement, influence in the project, and their impact in means of ability to effect changes to the project planning or execution. Power, urgency, and legitimacy. This model is also known as salience model. Here, stakeholders are classified by their power, urgency, and legitimacy. The power interest model is the most widely used. As you can see from the figure, all stakeholders can be grouped into 4 categories and managed as follows. Stakeholders with high power and high interest should be managed closely with most care. High power and low interest should be kept satisfied. Low power and high interest should be kept informed. Low power and low interest require lesser effort. They should be only monitored. We are at the third step of analyzing stakeholders. Step 3. Evaluating and assessing the whole information in order to plan how to influence the stakeholders, to increase their support and minimize the negative impacts. The second tools and technique in the process of identifying stakeholders is expert judgment. You need to evaluate and validate the collected stakeholders' information and created documents to ensure efficient and accurate identification. This is done by asking individual experts with specialized knowledge through one-on-one meetings or interviews, and also through groups with specific expertise by performing focus groups, surveys, etc. Those individuals or groups are senior management, other units within the organization, identified stakeholders, project managers who may work on projects in the same area directly or through lessons learned, subject matter experts in business or project area, industry group or consultants, and professional or technical associations. The third tools and technique in the identifying stakeholders process is meetings. This is all about organizing meetings focused on understanding of major project stakeholders. For example, profile analysis meetings for exchanging and analyzing information about rules, interests, and the knowledge of each stakeholder. The only output from the identifying stakeholders process is a Stakeholder Register. A Stakeholder Register is a document contains the information about all project stakeholders. It identifies and lists the people, groups, and organizations that are impacted by the project. The Stakeholder Register usually contains three types of information. Identification information includes their names, title, and role. Assessment information includes interest, power, requirements, expectation, and influence. Classification information, for example, whether the person is an internal, external, positive, supporter, resistor, or neutral stakeholder. You are free to customize the stakeholder register as per your project requirement. The stakeholder register should be reviewed and updated on a regular basis, because you may add or remove stakeholders throughout the project lifecycle. Here is an example of a stakeholder register. It may have the following information: the name of the stakeholder, the title held by the stakeholder, the role of the stakeholder in the project and in the organization, the contact information of the stakeholder, requirements from the project, expectation from the project, interest whether high, medium, or low. We arrived to the slide where we demonstrate the inputs and outputs from the Identfy stakeholder process. The inputs to this process were the project charter from the develop project charter process, and procurement documents from plan procurement process if a contract exists. The third and fourth inputs were the enterprise environmental factors and organization process assets. After performing the tools and technique, we came out with the stakeholder register, which will be needed as an input to the following processes. Collect requirements, plan quality management, plan communication management, plan risk management, identify risks, plan procurement management, plan stakeholder management. Those are the processes which we will see the stakeholder register as an input. You may play back this slide more times to dump this view in your brain, because understanding the flow of the processes is much better than memorizing the tools and technique. We arrived to the end of this episode. Now we are able to list what we need to create a stakeholder register. You will also be able to identify the major stakeholders in your project and discovering stakeholders which may contribute to stakeholder register creation. Also, you will be able to analyze stakeholders' influences in your project. At the end, you will be able to create stakeholder register for your project. I hope it was informative for you, and thank you for watching.